Well, thank you all for coming to the Harry and Shirley show. From what I understand, this is a pilot for a TV series that, if it works, will be long running on Netflix, so you can follow it regularly. We've been very fortunate over the last several years to have Professor Harding at our school and in our social science department. And part of the benefit of that has been to have Shirley spend time with us as well. So before they, unfortunately, sort of depart from us, we wanted to borrow from them intellectually one more time and to learn what they have been learning for a number of years now and sharing it with other people. I've known Harry since, I guess it was not, okay. The one thing I always like to say is I look much older than him, but he's much older than me. And so I was just a graduate student the first time that I met Harry, and he was teaching at that point at Stanford, and has had an illustrious career, teaching at various places, going out of one of the few academics who has done so well academically and yet has often been willing to take the risk and go outside of academia and to work somewhat in the corporate sector. We had him come and talk a number of years ago about risk analysis, which is that, I think that was when you were at the Eurasia Group? Correct. Yes, good. My memory has not completely gone away. Shirley Lin graduated from Harvard, has a PhD in political science from Hong Kong U. We'll forgive her for that. She also crosses the line, or sort of between academic pursuits and business. I think that gives her a unique perspective on the Cross-Straits relationship, and so that's enough. All right? They both have been at the university, as you can see. They both are at the University of Virginia. Shirley's at Chinese U. I said Harry's with us. So, with no further ado, you've got your own mic.
I have my own mic.
Great.
I think there is a clicker here.
I hope so.
Well, thank you, David, very much for the nice introduction.
It's almost as nice as the first one.
It's an enormous pleasure for Shirley and me to be here. It's a great honor always to be invited to speak at the Institute for Advanced Studies here at HKUST. And thank you all for coming. We thank those who made this possible, David Zweig, Kelly Tsai, and Linus C. And I'm sure there are other staff at the Institute as well. Thank you all for making this possible. We are going to tell you two stories today. The first story is about the emergence and consolidation of a Taiwanese identity. And we're going to explain, more precisely, Shirley is going to explain how that happened and how that has and continues to pose challenges to the three major parties involved in the cross-strait relationship: Taiwan itself, mainland China, and the United States. The second story that we're going to tell you is about how the developments on Taiwan parallel or mirror developments in many other advanced economies around the world, including, of course, Hong Kong. And so that is a second comparative story. The first one is more of a narrative story. So, aha, I have to turn. Wait, no, I pointed in that direction. Thank you. There we go. All stories have starting points. It's that once upon a time moment where the storyteller begins. And for us, the starting point is the 1992 consensus. I may have to stand over here so I can see the screen a little bit better. The 1992 consensus. That was a tacit understanding, not a formal document, certainly nothing that was signed, but a tacit understanding between Taipei and Beijing that enabled the following year, 1993 in Singapore, the first high-level, still unofficial but quasi-official dialogue between the two sides since the Civil War had ended in the late 1940s. The two people involved, as many of you know, were Gu Jianfu, a very senior banking official, banking company executive, member of a very illustrious family originally from Shanghai, representing what was called the Straits Exchange Foundation, and Wang Daohan, the former mayor of Shanghai, representing its counterpart, the Association for Relations Across the Taiwan Strait. At that time, when they met, the situation was the following. This is the baseline. And Shirley will describe how it's changed, and then we'll both describe the consequences of that change. At that time, a majority of people on Taiwan, by every measure we have, early public opinion polls confirm this, regarded themselves to be Chinese. The governments of both China and Taiwan were committed to the eventual unification of Taiwan with the rest of China. Of course, that's always been the goal of the Chinese Communist Party, so nothing new or surprising there. But we have to remember that even though Lee Teng-hui, the first Taiwanese president of Taiwan, was president at the time, he had sponsored the creation of what were called the National Unification Guidelines and the National Unification Council. And this embodied the fact, the idea, that this was still, unification of China, was still the goal of Taiwan as well as of Beijing. They obviously had two different versions and visions of how that would be accomplished and what it would mean. And that's why the so-called 92 consensus is one China, each with its own interpretation. But again, both were committed to one China, and that meant, as we see it, a commitment to eventual unification. At the same time, both governments recognized that their economies would benefit from expanded economic and societal relationships. China was seeking incoming foreign investment from abroad to provide capital, technology, management skills, access to brands, access to marketing networks overseas, and Taiwan was an obvious candidate to provide those things. For its part, Taiwan was experiencing rising labor costs, and Taiwanese businessmen, the so-called Taishang, were eager to relocate some of their production facilities across the straits to take advantage of lower costs in a culturally familiar society. So when they met in 1993 in Singapore, the two sides had an optimistic view, both about their economic and societal relationship, but also about the potential political spillover. After the meeting, cross-strait economic ties grew very, very rapidly in terms of both trade and investment. Many Chinese, Americans, and Taiwanese thought that Taiwan's economic integration with China would improve their political relationship. Shirley, she may talk about this, especially if you ask her. She was in Singapore at the time and observed the Guwang talks, and she can describe the emotion, the reaction surrounding them in 1993 in Singapore. And therefore, many in both the United States and China could assume that peaceful unification was a likely outcome over time. America could therefore have a one China policy. One China policy meant that we would restrict our official contacts with the Taiwan government. We had, of course, recognized the PRC and de-recognized Taiwan in 1978-79. But as part of that, we also maintained limited, unofficial, notionally unofficial ties with Taiwan, but also had some official exchanges even up to and including the cabinet level. Still was something we called our one China policy. We said that we would support the peaceful unification of Taiwan Taiwan issue on terms that were mutually and genuinely acceptable to both sides. We pledged not to support Taiwanese independence, not to maintain a one China, one Taiwan policy, and not to support Taiwanese membership in international organizations where membership was open only to sovereign states. But we also provided a dual deterrence policy, and that was to discourage, mainly by political means in the case of Taiwan, but in military means in the case of the mainland, try to discourage unilateral actions by either side. A unilateral declaration of independence by Taiwan and the use of force or coercion by Beijing. But that was then, and this is now. And over the last decade or so, the situation has fundamentally changed. And Shirley is going to pick up that part of the story. Taiwan has embraced a democratic political system. She's not going to do it quite yet. I still have a few more lines to share with you. Taiwan has embraced a democratic political system, and partly as a result of that, the people of Taiwan have forged an identity that is Taiwanese rather than Chinese. Fewer people on Taiwan support unification, even under the most favorable, positive conditions. A democratic China, a prosperous China. And so fewer and fewer people on Taiwan support unification under any conceivable scenario. China's national power has greatly increased, which makes the American policy of deterrence of the PRC from attacking Taiwan more risky and more costly. As I've said, these developments are posing difficult dilemmas for all three of the major parties to this relationship. Now I get to turn it over to Shirley to describe how this affected Taiwanese policy, economic policy in particular, towards.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes. Okay, so the mic works. Thank you, Harry. Well, I thought I would start. I usually don't start this way, but I thought I would start today by talking about why we are doing this talk. As you know, Harry is a US-China specialist. I've written a book recently about this topic, but we decided to do this together a few months ago after my book was published. And oftentimes, even though it was not included in my original talk, people say, why did you start this project in the first place? And to me, it's really a project, because as opposed to most students, I was a very, very old student. I was the oldest PhD student at Hong Kong U in my department. And I had decided to do so because of a puzzle that I thought I wanted to find out the answer. So unlike other people who get a PhD and decided to go find a puzzle so they can get a PhD, I decided I had a puzzle. And therefore, the best way to find out about it was to get a PhD. And so this is what the puzzle was. The puzzle was I have been working in investment banking for 15 years in private equity and in venture capital. And I said to myself, it seems I had wonderful opportunities in the private sector because the Taiwanese government was irrational, non-rational, and throwing its future away with China. In 1996, I was able to start making investments in China because Taiwanese companies could not go to China. And this is because after Taiwan democratized in the late 1980s, in 1995-96, Taiwan's first democratically elected president, Lee Teng-hui, decided to visit Cornell. Very, very bad idea. It raised US-China relations to the highest tension until now with North Korea, of course, creating another crisis. But 95-96, after Lee Teng-hui visited Cornell, Beijing decided to aim missiles at the waters around Taiwan. And this led to President Lee Teng-hui basically legislating no haste, be patient, which stopped all major investments into China. And that included semiconductor, petrochemical, infrastructure, and major investments over a certain dollar amount, depending on the net asset value of the company. Then in 2001, the first democratically elected Democratic Progressive Party candidate, Chen Shui-bian, and his right-hand woman, somebody curiously by the name of Tsai Ing-wen, ran Mainland Affairs Office. That is the current president of Taiwan. and she actually was his a key member of his administration in figuring out what to do with China. They decided in 2001 that they had no friends in business, so they needed to open up and get businesses, cozy up to the businesses, if you will. And so they wanted to open up specifically semiconductor investments in going to China. So in 2001, they decided to do so, and there was great opposition. Students like yourself, professors, union leaders all went on the street to protest. So these two episodes were happening when I was most active in making investments in China. And I thought this was absolutely irrational. And who are making these policy recommendations? And why are people supporting such policies? And then in 2006 and 2008, things started to change. 2006, Chen Shui-bian in his second term was facing a huge crisis of being accused of being involved in corruption, including his wife and his son, much less his daughter. But in 2006, to appeal to the base, like so many leaders in today's democratic societies do, he decided to reverse his previous, let's say, active opening and make it active management to restrict investments once again to China. In 2008, KMT returned to power with Ma Ying-jeou as the president, and the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement was the first bilateral agreement between Taiwan and China that actually allowed for extensive liberalization between Taiwan and China. But of course, something very important that many of you would know as students in political economy is that China favors something called the Framework Agreement. And Framework Agreement, it really isn't much of an agreement until follow-on agreements actually are signed. So in 2013, Ma Ying-jeou signed something called the signed a Service Trade Pact that was meant to liberalize the services sector in Taiwan and would allow Chinese to invest in Taiwan and bring perhaps managers and workers over. And in March 2014, as it was being ratified by the legislature, by the parliament, students occupied the legislature and protested for 24 days, which led to the Service Trade Pact until today not being ratified. So what is that puzzle all about? Well, initially, having been in the private sector, of course, I was very focused on data. I thought data could explain this all. There must be so many losers from these economic liberalization measures that the losers, of course, have to go head on with the winners who are probably colluding with the government. And it took me a few years in the pursuit of this answer to find out that there was no answer to be found in the data. And I slowly drifted into reading more and more and broader, so dangerous for a PhD student, delaying things ever so more. But then I realized the answer was actually because all of the literature, the primary material, newspapers or magazines talking about these economic policies, if you look into the debate at the time, most people were not talking about data or actually economic consequences of these measures. But they were talking about what this would do to our sense of Taiwanese identity. So I found it fascinating, and you can see here, of course, as Taiwan's trade and investment with China grew from 1990 to 2016 to be more than $150 billion in both two-way trade as well as outward foreign direct investment, this was what was happening in parallel in terms of national identity. Now, when you talk about national identity, and this is something that is quite important to many societies, including Hong Kong, in terms of not national, but just in terms of what it means to be a Hong Konger, there's a couple of ways to measure that, because it's both what you think of yourself, self-identification, and what you think of your relationship as a society to China. So the first measure of that is in 1992, you can see Zhenji University started this poll that is the most reliable and the longest time data series for self-identification. You'll see that 25%, it's actually more than 25, more than a quarter of Taiwanese said that they were Taiwanese when you ask them if you're Taiwanese, Chinese, or both. And then by 2016, December 31, by the end of 2016, this number is now 3.5%. So it's a dramatic decline. The top line shows those who are Taiwanese and both Taiwanese and Chinese. And while you could see it went from 60% to now over 93% ever since 2009, what is more important is that Taiwanese have been more than, those who say they are only Taiwanese and nothing but Taiwanese is now more than 50% since 2007. So that's quite important. And Harry has already mentioned that in 1989, before this Zhenji University study started, in 1989, United Press, the leading newspaper at the time, had its first poll, and 52% of Taiwanese people thought they were Chinese. 52% to today's 3% is an astounding change, reversal of identity. And this is quite rare in any other parts of the world. The second measure of Taiwanese identity is what we call preferred future national status. You probably would say, like many others who have heard me speak or read my book, that self-identification is crude and polls are not reliable. And I would agree, especially in this instance when we're trying to find out what people think of economic policy, it's very important to dig deeper. And this is a study that asks you in a 7-way poll, do you support status quo, decide later, status quo, indefinitely, status quo for independence, status quo for eventual unification, or immediate unification and immediate independence. And I separated the 7-way poll into, I grouped them into 2 lines. And the reason is because Beijing only really cares about the bottom line. The bottom line are those who support unification, which has dropped from 1984 from 20% to less than 10%. It's been less than 10% for since 2008. And you can see that, more importantly, you cannot see it, but I would like you to note that those who support unification as soon as possible is now today at 1.7% as of 2016 year end. 1.7%, it's been under 2% since 2009. So the trend is very clear. What does it mean then to have a Taiwanese identity, and why is it relevant to what we are talking about today, the dilemma? Well, after democratization, Taiwanese identity, like many other countries in Eastern Europe, for example, or the Middle East, was initially polarized along ethnic lines. There was a sense of who we are and who we are not. And that was because in 1949, when the nationalist government, the Kuomintang, went to Taiwan, they decided to continue to run Taiwan as if they were running China. This meant everyone with their ID card, and here you all appreciate how important an ID card is. And in Taiwan, the ID card, continuing the policy that the KMT actually instituted in mainland China, it had a province of origin field in it. So if you are from Shanghai in 1949, you have children in Taipei, your children would also be Shanghainese, your grandchildren would also be Shanghainese, until this policy was revoked. Those who were Taiwanese were called 本省人, those who were not Taiwanese were called 外省人 in social terms. And this created a big divide because all civil servant examinations and many other kinds of allocation actually had to, including getting into a college, a university like Hong Kong UST that is very highly sought after, has to do with your province of origin. You would get extra points if you're from certain places. And of course, the Taiwanese had a very small number of quota compared to those from other provinces in any civil service examination. And this was seen to be, of course, a kind of a segregation policy that that would underlie the initial discussion that was very polarizing and very very divisive. But something very interesting happened as 1990 introduced something for the Taiwanese. For 40 years, unlike Hong Kong, where there was a divide, this was a colony, but the border was very porous. And I was just reading an account of the 1967 riot last night. You could see even during the Cultural Revolution, there was a lot of movement. But of course, Taiwan was totally different. For 40 years, literally nobody except for spies and special mission went to China or came from China, those who defected. And so in 1990, what was astounding is that the border opened up. And slowly there were people who went back to China to visit their relatives. And those started to go as tourists, especially young people. And as economic and social integration with China deepened, identity, on the other hand, consolidated and became more and more Taiwanese. And increasingly, people started saying, well, maybe we're not Taiwanese because we're not Chinese by blood. Because they went to China and they realized, well, most people, 98% of Taiwanese are Han Chinese, so they are Chinese ethnically. So what is it that makes Taiwanese different? People started saying, well, if you go to China, you can see the real Chinese. So we must not be Chinese because we're not the real Chinese. But who are we? So from saying what we are not to saying what we are was a very, very long way. It took well more than a decade, but increasingly you'll see, especially in discussing economic policy toward China, people started to talk about the Taiwanese way of life, and it meant that if you live on the island and you embrace civic values like democracy, rule of law, freedom of speech, press, and assembly, then you must be Taiwanese. Whether you are from, originally your parents are from China, or you could be a new immigrant who's married to a Taiwanese, you're from Indonesia, you're from Fujian, but as long as you actually become an important member of the society and you want to see the place prosper and you intend to live here, you should be Taiwanese. And this discussion replaced the old divisive, polarizing discussion and was important in leading the Taiwanese. In fact, just last week there was a new poll that shows Taiwanese support economic liberalization, support free trade agreements at a record high. So it's very interesting, as Taiwanese identity consolidated, people started saying that economic liberalization is important, is good for us, and we should not be resisting it on grounds of our identity being diluted. What I'm more interested in now in my next project is what young people think, because increasingly young people think differently than older people. And Harry and I just came back from Korea and Beijing, where we gave talks in both English and in Chinese and interacted with a large number of young people. And it's really interesting to see many people in both Beijing and in Seoul think that the older generation simply cannot solve some of the issues we have because they're emotionally vested in these problems. Younger generations don't have the same burden as the older generation, and they care a lot about the environment, for example. They want clean air, clean water, safe food. They want to be internationally recognized, even though Taiwan is not a nation. I gave many talks in the United States in 18 universities, and I ran into students at many places who insisted on asking me if I had a Taiwan passport, and if I did I put a sticker on the passport to cover the passport up? And I thought, what a minor issue. But no, this was very all-consuming to the students. They brought their passports to my talk and showed me their passport. As you know, there's a movement to change the name among young people of Taiwan from Republic to China, of China to something more assertive, Beijing would say. And these things are very important to younger generations. And they believe in free markets, but under the premise of Taiwan first. And I would say to you that Taiwan first was a very important part of the Taiwanese narrative during presidential campaigns, way before Trump made it fashionable to talk about America first. So the framework of my book basically is, without a sense of identity, you cannot decide what is your interest. Without knowing what your interests are and how to prioritize it, you cannot have a proper discussion. And without a proper discussion, of course, it's hard to derive at a consensus on economic policy. And without a consensus, of course, if you see in the case of Taiwan, implementation was very problematic. When policies were implemented that were controversial, businesses simply evaded implementation. And this is quite important if you look at many other countries like Ukraine, like Belarus, without a strong sense of who you were as a nation, it is very hard to decide whether if something's good for China, is it good for Taiwan? If you're Chinese, obviously what's good for China is good for Taiwan. But if you're Taiwanese, what's good for China has nothing to do with what's good for Taiwan. They're simply different entities. So the definition of identity was extremely important in many, many newly democratic societies. And this is the data in my book. I won't go over it, but what is important to note on this chart is for each what I call episode. And I examine the debate that leads to those policies being implemented. Very extreme policies, no haste, very extreme policy, active opening, and then more moderate policy, active management, and much more moderate policy, prosper again, or the ECFA, because of societal input into these policies and a sense that it was very important to look at how these policies were creating jobs, creating GDP growth. But on this chart, what's important is you'll say, well, the missile crisis, the global financial crisis, they must be very important to what people think of their priorities. Absolutely so. Because of the global financial crisis, while equity was very important for Taiwanese, growth and stability, these are all very important considerations. But when the missile crisis happened, security was almost the only interest you could find in the discussion about policy. People were overly concerned or extremely focused on what would make Taiwan militarily and economically secure. So the missile crisis would not threaten Taiwan again. And so you can see that interest, the list of interests keeps growing, and I'll explain later why these interests are so important in terms of their priority. The conclusion of the book is that when identity is contested, debates over policies are very emotional, and you can see that in the first two episodes. As identity consolidates, these extreme policy options, extreme political candidates, become less appealing, and the nature of the debate becomes more rational, like in the 2010 ECFA. But a consensus is still elusive because of the trade-off, because you can't have growth and equity and military and economic security without having a proper discussion of what is most important at that stage. And these trade-offs are inherent in any trade agreement with another economy. Of course, we see this now in the United States. Identity can return to become salient again just when you think it has consolidated. And the threat to the identity increases. So the students often talked about how their sense of identity was being threatened when they were protesting against the service trade agreement. And that debate was commingled with the discussion that young people thought they would lose their jobs to mainland Chinese students who would come to Taiwan, stay to work, or that the mainland Chinese investments would take over the Chinese economy, the Taiwanese economy, and it would become more like Hong Kong, where the largest companies were state-owned enterprises. And this discussion of the economic impact, as well as the value differential and an identity threat, were both present in the discussion that led to an overwhelming support for the sunflower movement. So here I would like to ask, does anyone know what the sunflower meant for the Taiwanese student? What was it a symbol of? Somebody wants to answer. Yes, the young lady in pink. No? Okay. The sunflowers were not native to Taiwan, but they're growing everywhere in southern Taiwan. They come from southern Spain. If you go to, I studied in Spain for a year. First time I went, I was astounded. It was all yellow when you drive past Sevilla. And I had never seen anything like it. Well, in 30 years, you have that in southern Taiwan. It's like lavender in Hokkaido, sunflowers in Taiwan. It's very foreign. But it's a symbol of globalization. You could take something and move it somewhere else, and it will thrive and grow. And the students wanted to say they support globalization, but they didn't support the way that it was being implemented, that it was being carried out in Taiwan. So on the day the service trade agreement was being pushed through the legislature, and that was because the KMT actually controlled the executive branch with Ma Ying-jeou as the president, but they also had a majority in the legislature, in the parliament. So in 30 seconds, in March 2014, the KMT tried to ratify the service trade agreement under the ECFA. And that evening, the students were very angry that this process did not go through what they considered to be proper procedure and consultation with the public, including young people. So they broke into the parliament and occupied it for 24 days. They lived there, they slept there, they ate there. You can see here, there's yoga stations, there's first aid stations, medical school students and nurses came out to help on the street because this spilled over to the street. And students started to occupy the areas around the parliament, so that universities basically stopped functioning after only 5 days. And they moved to the protest ground to lecture. And at first, Taiwanese were not terribly supportive of this because they were breaking the law, and the rule of law is pretty important to a newly democratized society. So over time, however, the students appeal to the public by changing really their narrative about what they were fighting for. And they started to focus on the fact that the democratic procedures were not being followed, and that everyone in Taiwan should look at this as a threat to democracy. And this gained this echo throughout the society. So that after the first weekend, you could see that young professionals started to come after work to provide water and food for the students. And then this is the first weekend after the students occupied the legislature. There were big protests this is in Taipei, and later it spread throughout the island. You could see young and old coming together to support the students. They were carrying umbrellas, although it was not foreshadowing the umbrella movement. It was simply the weather. So in short, what is Taiwan's dilemma? I think that Taiwan continues to actually be in this very, very difficult situation where it has to consider how to make Taiwan competitive again and strong again. So the first option, of course, is should Taiwan increase its competitiveness by deepening economic integration with China? And to do this, to go back to what Harry was talking about, it has to agree to the 92 consensus. Beijing says that is the red line. You can see here is a woman shaking her hands with a man. And this is, of course, an important alternative because for everything that I have just said, about the sunflower movement. China is still one of the fastest growing economies in the world. If not integrating with China, where would Taiwan find its economic future? And on the other hand, Taiwan really cannot try to be more competitive by working elsewhere because China would obstruct Taiwan signing any free trade agreement or preferential trade agreement with any other country since it's not a country. The alternative view is Taiwan should diversify its economic relations and reduce its dependence on China. And on this side of the argument, you can see this is a poster of an upcoming talk on 5th generation telecom equipment in Brussels, June 2017. Taiwan is hoping to work more with EU, with the US, with Japan. And one of the key reasons is that Taiwan is falling into what I call the high income trap, like Korea, like Japan. It is unable to move up in the value chain. It continues to produce very low, it continues to focus on low-cost manufacturing by moving into China from the coastal to the inland and now to Southeast Asia and to South Asia, like Chinese companies are doing. But it is not actually creating more innovation or more value-added services and reducing its interdependence with the advanced economies is hurting Taiwan. This is what this school of thought would tell you. But I would contend that after studying, of course, Taiwan and the relationship between the discussion on identity and economic policy, the real finding, which is not in my book, is that Beijing has a greater dilemma because the trend of identity has moved so far out that people in Beijing are scratching their head and say, so how do we reverse it? What choices do we have? And I'll give this back to Harry.
Thank you, Shirley. So what can Beijing do? What can the mainland do, if anything, to try to reverse the trend towards not just a separate self-identification, but towards a declining interest in the goal of eventual unification? We call these dilemmas because, just as Shirley has shown for Taiwan, there are no easy choices here. There are no options that dominate the debate, that dominate a rational consideration of costs and benefits. All of the choices have positive and negatives and great uncertainties. In the case of Beijing, we see that China faces three options, none of which are, or I should say, none of which is ideal. One is simply to stay the course and to argue that basically what drives the world is economics and economic logic, and that basically economic integration eventually will produce a resurgence of Chinese identity on Taiwan. That kind of economic integration, more frequent political dialogue, will eventually reverse these trends. The fact that it hasn't done that so far, and in fact has just had the opposite effect, of course, these people would say it hasn't been long enough yet. Eventually, this strategy will work, and anyway, this has the fewest obvious immediate downsides. This doesn't run any short-term risks. Hopefully, it will eliminate the long-term problem. What would that look like? It would look like more agreements on various economic issues, perhaps working together to solve some of the economic problems, the inequalities, the uncertainties facing the Taiwanese economy and the business community in China, and that this would, again, contribute to a sense of common identity and common destiny. This could be reflected in continued high-level meetings. The 93 meetings in Singapore were technically unofficial, but the meeting in Singapore in 2015 between Ma Ying-jeou and Xi Jinping was a meeting between two presidents. And the Ma Xi meeting, Xi Ma meeting, depending on which side you're on of the Taiwan Strait you're on, could be the precedent for further highest level political dialogue that could also have a broader spillover onto identity. But increasingly, some people in China are saying, if it hasn't worked so far, it may not work in the future either. And if we don't do something else, that trend may just become deeper and deeper and harder to reverse. So maybe we need a plan B. And the second option, of course, would be to increase the pressure. And that is to apply diplomatic and economic sanctions and even some kind of military action unless Taiwan recommits to unification. What might that look like? Well, we've already seen that strategy back in 1995-96 with the missile tests, and China, of course, continues to build up its military forces opposite Taiwan, not only with regard to missiles, but with regard to airborne forces, to amphibious forces, cyber forces, all a way of applying military pressure to Taiwan if and when Beijing so chooses to do. In case there's any doubt about the intention here, here is a screenshot from one of the CCTV stations, CCTV 7, back around the election time, if I remember correctly. Again, these demonstrations tend to coincide with Taiwanese elections aimed at affecting the outcome. And here, as it says the People's Liberation Army practices an attack on the Taiwan presidential palace, the Zhongkongfu. And sure enough, there in the background is apparently a full-scale model of the presidential palace that the Beijing forces, they invaded by land or by airdrop, doesn't matter, but this is what we can do if we so choose. So you guys had better pay attention. It's not just military, however, it can also be diplomatic. And it can be to reduce Taiwan's international space. This can be to persuade more countries that are Taiwan's so-called diplomatic allies, that is, countries that recognize the Republic of China government formally, officially, to break relations and recognize Taiwan. Recognize the PRC, sorry. The one big prize, remaining prize in this game is the Vatican. Vatican City, which is a sovereign state and is one of the most important of the holdouts. Others are in Central America. A handful, I think, are still in Africa. But these would have, especially if it's a major player, would send shockwaves, of course, through Taiwan, increase its diplomatic isolation. But it's not just diplomatic recognition. It is also trying to narrow Taiwan's space in international organizations, even those that Taiwan participates in as a non-sovereign state. And there are two primary examples. One is the World Health Organization, where Taiwan's participation as a health entity has been on again, off again, depending on whether Beijing favors it or not. Just got the news this morning that Taipei is going to try again to participate in the next meeting of the World Health Assembly. What Beijing's attitude is going to be remains to be seen. There's also the International Civil Aviation Organization, where China had had some kind of non-member status, and all of a sudden that door was closed at the most recent meeting, so narrowing Taiwan's international space. The picture of the young lady with the two flags was probably the most emotional for Taiwanese example of a reaction to increasing the pressure. This was a young Chinese woman pop singer who participated in a song contest in Korea right before the 2016 elections. And like all the other candidates, or at least all of the other finalists, when she went on stage, she carried two flags, the Republic of Korea flag, the host country, and her own national flag. Immediately, the netizens in China, the blogosphere, went ballistic. How dare she wave her Taiwan flag? And if she's doing that, no more business for her in China. Her Chinese agents dropped her immediately. Tours, performing tours of the mainland were canceled. And she was forced, basically 2 days before the election in Taiwan, to make a videotaped apology. You still see it online, I'm sure, a groveling apology. No, she's, as Shirley would say, I'm Chinese and only Chinese, not Taiwanese. I'm so sorry, I made a mistake. And as so many of these pressure tactics have had in the past, this had a negative effect on Taiwanese opinion. The evidence indicates that this contributed to the landslide for Tsai Ing-wen 2 days later, especially among younger voters who were deeply angered by this use of pressure against simply a young woman not involved in politics, a performer who made an error in judgment simply by trying to express her national identity. So those are the two options so far, to try to continue, stay the course, or increase the pressure. The third one that Shirley and I think would be the most likely to succeed, but also would have the greatest costs and risks for the mainland, would be to narrow the gap, to undertake reforms, yes, including political reforms, that would reduce the differences between the two political systems. What might those look like? It might be following the path that Taiwan started way, way back, many decades ago, and that is to increase local elections, going from the bottom of the political system higher and higher towards the top, and perhaps even to include non-party candidates. Taiwan, as many of you may know, the term danwai was developed to refer to candidates who were outside the Kuomintang. Would China be willing to do this, to expand the electoral process in terms of level and in terms of choice? Could China decide to increase the scope of civil society? In other words, to begin to adopt, obviously in a limited way at first, some of the same civic values that, as Shirley has demonstrated, are so important to the Chinese identity and their definition of that identity as a way of life. Right now, the trends are going in the opposite direction, as we all know. But hypothetically, the Chinese could choose this strategy as well as the other ways of narrowing the gap that I've mentioned. Whether that would work, again, nobody knows. How far it would have to go to work, nobody knows. And that's why there is such a risk for China. But we believe that, given the present situation and likely trends, this would be the strategy that would have the greatest chance of success. But it's not just Taipei and not just Beijing that are challenged by this changing identity on Taiwan. Washington also has a Taiwan dilemma. Basically, as I've said, the American interest, not always explicitly stated, as bluntly as I'm going to do it, has been that we would like to have a peaceful final solution that would basically enable the United States to step back from its dual deterrence policy with all of the costs and risks, to resolve this most difficult and emotional issue in the US-China relationship, And as I've argued, there was a sense, starting with the Shanghai Communique in 1972 and going through normalization and beyond, that peaceful unification would be that solution. It would take a long time, but things were moving in that direction. One can no longer say that. I like to remind you that one of the most important passages in the 72 Shanghai Communique was the following. The United States acknowledges that Chinese on both sides, I think all Chinese, on both sides of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China. The United States does not challenge that position. But the only way that statement is still true is if you define Chinese as being those who identify as Chinese on the Taiwan side of the strait. All of that dwindling number of people who say we're Chinese, yes, some of them still support unification, but unfortunately that's a smaller and smaller number. Otherwise, this basic premise of American policy going back to 1972 is being challenged by these developments that Shirley has described so well. Also, don't forget that in the period of recognition, Nixon visit, recognition, and normalization of relations, Taiwan was not a democracy. It was an authoritarian system. And therefore, its appeal to the United States was because of its opposition to communist China. As American relations with China improved, and as Taiwan democratized, Taiwan could play a different role and appeal for different reasons. As a democratic society, the first Chinese democracy that deserved American support. At the same time, as China became more powerful militarily, that was not just part of a strategy of putting pressure on Taiwan, but was a way of warning the United States that any attempt to defend Taiwan against a Chinese attack, for whatever reason, would have increasing costs and risks to the United States. Now, the United States, too, has options. But again, it's a dilemma because none of them is ideal. What do we see as the options facing the United States? One would be to upgrade America's relations with Taiwan. Here the argument would be we can no longer pretend that Taiwan's government does not exist. We must recognize the fact that not only does Taiwan have a government, not only does it have a president, but that government and that president have been democratically elected by the Taiwanese people. And that Taiwan is a major economy and a major society. And it is unacceptable, opponents would say, that Taiwan does not have a bigger role in the international community. If there are health problems that affect Taiwan or begin on Taiwan, some kind of an epidemic of some sort, it would be very risky if Taiwan is excluded from the World Health Organization. Taiwan is a major airline hub. It has 2 major airlines of its own. Why is it acceptable for Taiwan to be excluded from the International Civil Aviation Organization, proponents would say. So it's time, they would say, to face reality, to be pragmatic. Taiwan exists, and the United States should upgrade its relations. What might this look like? Well, we've already seen one indication in the phone call that was emphasized. Mr. Trump was not president when he took this call. Tsai Ing-wen certainly was. And you could have that kind of a higher level dialogue, more phone calls, maybe even meetings, although that would really break the existing protocols. Have higher level official exchanges, cabinet level meetings with Taiwan. You could upgrade more or less, but official contacts would be one. The other would be, and here Mr. Trump has said he wants to increase, as President Obama did, the American military presence in the Western Pacific, to do that, but more explicitly to say that this is to enable the United States to maintain the policy of dual deterrence vis-a-vis the PRC. So that's one option, that is to upgrade relations with Taiwan. The other option, which is also advocated by some in the United States, is basically to reduce the American commitment to Taiwan in exchange for Chinese accommodations on other issues. Obviously, there could be accommodations on Taiwan as well, on the Taiwan issue. But I think most of the people who argue this say it's very unlikely that mainland China will change its red line or its formula for eventual unification. So if we're going to make a deal, we've got to get concessions on other issues. There are various views of this, whether it is a so-called grand bargain, a global bargain, or if it's more a narrower bargain on specific issues. For example, say, again, the North Korea nuclear program. Let's make a deal. Let's back away a bit from Taiwan and, for example, to now for the first time say that we favor the peaceful unification of Taiwan and the mainland. We have never said that. We could. We could reduce rather than increase arms sales to Taiwan in exchange for something else. So that's another option. And then finally, of course, as always, the final option is no change. Basically, to maintain the existing protocols and policies on the assumption that this is not Beijing's first choice, but it will be acceptable. And that is what President Trump seemed to do when he arranged for the summit at Mar-a-Lago with Xi Jinping, where he said he will continue to respect the one China policy. Of course, Mr. Trump being Mr. Trump, never defining what he believes the one China policy to be. But this is an option, and it seems to be the course that the United States is presently taking. As I said, the other story we're telling is about how Taiwan exemplifies broader trends. I'll give the clicker back to Shirley, and she's going to explain why this is an absolutely fascinating and important photograph.
So for the last part of our talk, we wanted to tell you why Taiwan is a unique problem, yet at the same time extremely global in the problems that it has. Here's a picture of Harry and I finally going to visit several of the countries I wrote about that has identity polarization and issues with economic policies. And this is in Budapest, where this little stall has all these flags, and Taiwan flag is the first one that you see. Well, you can see on his jacket, it's a flag of Catalonia. And he is holding a flag of Transylvania. That's where he's from, the hometown of Dracula. So he moved from Transylvania, which is under the Romanian government, to Budapest because he wanted to raise his children, his two sons, to be more Transylvanian. I'm not really sure what that means, not yet. I still haven't read enough to know. But he says it's very important, my sense of identity. And all these flags, he tells me, are flags of European nations, group of people that would like to have more autonomy. So the question is, why is Taiwan flag in it? It's not even near Europe. He says, well, Taiwan is the symbol of what we're fighting for. We want to be like Taiwan, but Taiwan is very, very vulnerable and could disappear anytime as an independent society. So the sense of rising local identity is all around the world. People want to belong to smaller units. They want to belong to a community where they can actually have, they can participate and be contributing to the value of that society. And you can see that all over Europe, where people are identifying themselves much, much less as European. In recent years' polls, you will see more as a national, Italian, French, German, rather than choosing to say they're European or both European and Italian. Here is a picture of Occupy Wall Street, which is a very, very important parallel to Taiwan. Occupy Wall Street is a protest against inequality by young people. Taiwan's inequality has also worsened dramatically, but I have learned on many, many trips that it is really a smaller issue in Taiwan than in many other societies. Yet, the sense of declining equality does not sit well with Taiwanese, who fought for decades for more economic growth and more equality. And that was the fundamental economic miracle of Taiwan, that there was more equality while there was high growth. Taiwan, 30 years ago, top 20% household income to the bottom 20% household income was a mere 4 times, and today it's 6.2 times. But in terms of Gini coefficient, of course, it cannot be compared to Hong Kong or China, which exceeds 0.5. Taiwan is 0.345. It's still quite equitable, but the decline, the worsening trend, has made people realize how precious it is. Here is a picture of protests in the main square of Madrid, Puerta del Sol. You'll see that there's a little sign on the left. The Spanish sign says, no to the privileged political class. This is a picture of both anti-elitism, but also protests against unemployment. Because of the austerity program, this picture taken on May 1, Labor Day 2015, youth unemployment in Spain was 49% to average of 25%. Taiwan is 12% versus 6%. You see similar problems in France, where it's 25% to 10%. And in Seoul, in Korea, and many other parts of the world, where the older generation have good jobs, and the younger generations don't have very good prospect. Here you can see Neil Farage with his anti-immigration poster. These are immigrants in the background. He says the EU has failed us all. It's asking for support for Brexit. And the generational divide here is also very meaningful. The older generation voted for Brexit, and the younger generation overwhelmingly voted to remain. Here you see support for Trump. This picture was taken many months before Trump rose in the poll. I was booed when I showed this picture in certain university campuses, but unfortunately. And I said, I'm merely telling you what the trends are. I think there's great support for Trump. And unfortunately, I was more right than I actually thought. I was only saying that to show a picture. But certainly, the older generation also voted more for Trump than the younger generation. So there's also an age divide in this phenomenon. I think Korea is the closest example to Taiwan because so many of the social economic issues are similar. The growth rate, the GDP per capita stage. Here, I would say the biggest parallel is anti-collusion. The perception was that the KMT was colluding with big businesses in its economic liberalization policy with China, and that perception, of course, drove the landslide victory for the DPP in January 2016. Here, we were in Seoul just last Saturday and Sunday, and there were one protest after another. The protest that we walked through on Saturday last week was pro-park protesters who wanted to find a way for her to get out of jail. And you could see that it was very much the older generation. I didn't see any young people actually on the street in support of her. And here we have also Moon and An, the leading candidates in the next presidential election in Korea. They also appeal very much to different classes, but I would think that they appeal more to different generations. Finally, what we just saw last Sunday is very important. You see non-establishment candidates are winning in the French presidential election. Both Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen are not what you would call establishment. And they appeal to, of course, entirely different kinds of voters. But the fact that these candidates are leading as opposed to experienced political leaders with established political parties, I think really comes back to my point that extreme political campaigns, political leaders, and policies can appeal when identity is threatened. And you will see all over the newspaper last weekend in analyzing the election result, the word identity came up in every single article repeatedly. So what I think Taiwan's experience is most important is that it is part of the high-income trap. The high-income countries are experiencing severe dislocations, and some say that we simply have to get used to the new normal. The new normal is high-income economies are fearing social consequences that come out of problems such as increasing inequality, slower growth, stagnating real wages, especially for young people, unskilled workers, aging population, low fertility. Hong Kong is up there in the world, but Korea was #1 last year, and Taiwan was #1 in 2011 in lowest fertility. So women don't want to get married. They don't want to have kids. And people live at home for a longer period of time. The United States today has more people living at home than ever since World War II. And what this means is there are fewer and fewer young people paying for more and more older people's welfare entitlement. Low interest rate environment has been very important to asset inflation, rising housing prices. We see in Hong Kong and Seoul and Taipei, of course in Beijing, but I think China is in a different category in the middle income trap. But all of these cities, young people would have to save more than 10 years, usually 20, maybe 25 years, in order to buy their own property. This sense of a generational injustice where the older generation simply had it better is causing a lot of political dislocation. And these political consequences partially mean a backlash against globalization, and dissatisfaction means a lot of young people are anti-establishment, anti-elite, and these trends produce extreme preferences, like in the case of Taiwan. And in Hong Kong, I think it resembles Taiwan the last 30 years in an extensive way. Young people in Taiwan believe that China presents mixed opportunities and threat because the economic benefits have been distributed very unevenly economically, but this also challenges Taiwanese autonomy and identity. They're skeptical about indiscriminate integration with China, whether social, economic, or political. And some of their concerns, you could say, is grounded on economic concerns that can be resolved or addressed by effective public policy. So if we have better policy, maybe we could save the environment. Maybe we could stop any more nuclear power plants from being built in Taiwan, take care of the inequality issue. But no high-income societies have solved the problem of pulling back inequality. And Japan, of course, is the best example of that. But young people say it's not just about economics. It's about value differences with China. How do you plan to bridge that? They say democracy, freedom of speech, social justice, international recognition and respect. And polls after polls, as Harry says, even under conditional polls where people are being asked if China today were to be economically, politically similar to Taiwan in every way, would you still support or oppose unification? And that number of the support for unification, even under conditional polls, is declining, especially among the young. And this, you see that in the protest. And young people are actively participating, like in Hong Kong last year. Localists gained many seats. In Taiwan, 5 young people who were leaders of the Sunflower Movement were voted into the parliament out of 113 seats, and their investment was very low. A new party, new group of people, within 1 year, were able to get 5 legislative seats in the parliament, and young people are not just actively participating on the street, they are actively trying to change the system. I, in fact, just came back from Taipei 2 Sundays ago. I was giving a closed-door talk to the new power party in Taipei, and there were very few people in the audience who was over 30. And it was really quite moving to me in terms of what they were asking about. Let me just say that I didn't expect many of the questions or any of the questions. Were totally different than the questions I get elsewhere. But of course, because these are party members who are helping the 5 legislators, and so they had very immediate policy questions about China, about the U.S., and I think that young people are trying to find alternatives because in Taiwan, young people do not support either the blue or the green in big numbers. They are skeptical of these established parties, just like all around the world. So on that note, Harry and I would love to take questions for the 20 minutes that we have left. I didn't bring any, we don't have any books here, but I have a flyer outside if you're interested in taking a look at the book, which I'm sure you can find in the library.
In terms of connecting some of these things together and going back to Harry's first point about the possibility of economic integration as a basis for motivating an interest in reunification, and correctly pointing out that that doesn't seem to be in the cards. And that connects to these issues of sort of anti-globalization and concerns about, I think, inequality that you were talking about, in the sense that I've always suspected that part of the reason that economic integration between the mainland and Taiwan essentially failed as a way of motivating interest in reunification is that the perception in Taiwan is that essentially it worked for the Wang Youqing and people like that, right? And the people that put those deals together, and that was all great for them. But if you're just a college graduate from some mediocre college in Taiwan, you probably and saw your job prospects declining because production was moving to the mainland. It didn't really do much for you. And so I always wonder whether if maybe back in the 90s, that when these economic integration was moving forward, had there been maybe more attentiveness to the fact that the benefits be broadly distributed and recognized as being broadly distributed, it might have had very different consequences. And I'm sure that part of the problem here in Hong Kong is that the benefits of economic integration, right, are not perceived as benefiting the average people in Hong Kong, and that we might have different outcomes now if they had been perceived as being distributed more widely. So I don't know if you want to talk about that, but is there any hope left for, say, economic integration if it somehow could, through some magic, be made to at least be perceived to be benefiting the rest of the people in Taiwan?
When I start, and then Shirley will take over. I think that economic integration does have important spillovers. Certainly it, I think, has reduced the chances of open conflict in the Taiwan Strait. It's now being tried in another form with incoming Chinese investment into the US, and I think it's also stabilizing the relationship. But it also produces problems. And as you say, the question that Shirley will address, I think, is whether better economic policy could have headed this off or not. But also, the political spillover is there, but it's limited. Political unification is the most ambitious political spillover. And if we don't see the United States and Canada talking, so we have at least one Canadian here, United States and Canada too. Oh my God, they're taking over.
He's joined,
okay. But if the United States and Canada are not talking about political unification with deeply interdependent economies, with similar values, somewhat different political structures for historical reasons, but still both liberal democracies, if we're not even talking about it, what hope is there for Taiwan and China reunifying?
Yeah, I agree with Harry in that economic interdependence has been beneficial to reduce the possibility of war. And of course, we know there's a large school of a lot of literature about this academically, that democracies don't fight each other. In this case, China is not a democracy, but basically with more trade and investment, the likelihood of confrontation is lowered. But the reason that has lowered is also now change. It's not because Taiwan is important. It's because I think China doesn't want the spillover if there would be confrontation with Taiwan. What about One Belt, One Road? All these great projects that China has. Taiwan should not rattle, this all this ambitious rising of China as a leader in the world. So I think that has positive consequences. But as Harry says, Canada and the US would be united by now as one country if the political spillover is so easily reached just by having more social and economic interaction. The project to have unification be supported is such a high bar that merely having economic benefits distributed evenly, I think would be actually beyond the scope. And that's why we talk about the different alternatives each of the three sides have. And I think for China to extend its soft power, mainlandization is the lowest form, I think, that would work. And in Taiwan, it doesn't even work because there's no mainlandization. The Taiwanese are so afraid that you cannot go study in Taiwan in universities, and now you finally can. The quota is very small. Not only that, mainland Chinese students come. If If they study, they cannot get a visa to work, which I think is ridiculous. Why educate people? So it's like the United States now. It's so hard to get your visa extended after you get your PhD. But this is because of the fear of mainlandization. And so Taiwan does not have immigrants except for spousal reunion. But look at the spousal reunion. There's only 200,000 mainland Chinese spouses, but they have already organized a political party. So they say, oh, well, everyone says, you see, that's what happens when you have immigration. And so there is much less of that kind of social integration. But I think to have a real political spillover, you really need to bridge the gap. And bridging the gap, speaking to young people, takes a lot. Unfortunately, leaders on both sides, Taiwan and China, but more on the Taiwan side, are very old. So this is a big issue. David.
One comment and one question. So the comment is that if you look at the relationship between Canada and the United States, Canadian identity is based largely on not being American. And so there's actually very little opportunity for reunification or unification, and that Canadian identity has been forged largely by threats from the United States, which somehow fits also with the Taiwan model because of wars, and the establishment of Canada in 1867 was in response largely to the North having a very powerful army with nothing to do. And so they talked about invading Canada. And so the British, rather than defending Canada, said, well, we'll just make you independent. So there's been that process. The one thing on the book and the discussion that struck me is missing, and I'm not sure how you would work it in. I never heard the word Taiwan-isher, right? The whole Li Denghui strategy of developing Taiwan consciousness. Right, that there was the emphasis is economic. I understand that, but it seems like there's a variable that's missing in terms of the explanation for the development of the identity, and that was conscious government policy by Li Denghui, and writing and literature and all that stuff that wasn't just a reaction to bad economic policy, but was actually a very strategic decision by Li to sort of block this process from happening.
Thank you, David. Of course, David always asks the most difficult question. What you're asking is something that I did not address very much in the book, which is how is identity formed? And that is a very, very complicated issue. I do address it in chapter 2, right on, to say this is not my expertise. I want to talk about the interrelationship between identity and policy. But as to how identity is derived, what you were referring to is very important, because in Beijing, that's often the most important question to them, which is how important is state education, state media, state a top-down effort to change identity, and how much of it is bottom-up. I think that Bentuhua and Taiwanese is a very important part of Taiwanese identity. It's just that I think today, if you look at the words, when Li Denghui started to talk about Bentuhua and Taiwanese, there was a real move. If you remember, in 1988, he was trying to get Ma Ying-jeou elected as the Taipei mayor. So he started saying, he's a new Taiwanese. And so there's all these variations of his narrative. But I think Li Denghui is one person. And I think young people, of course, today don't really think of him as the way the middle-aged people think of him, or as much of a threat as China thinks of him. I think young people are just totally different. And they don't need to be Bentuhua because they are Taiwanese. They grew up thinking that. So there's something called 天然, it's called 自然读, 自然绿, which is, you're naturally pro-independence, you're naturally green, because you're born without knowing something else. Whereas the rest of the people are still saying, oh, are we Chinese, are we Taiwanese? young people don't spend a second thinking about it. Why do they think about it? It's not important. They go to Shanghai for a birthday party on weekends. They go work in Beijing if they want for a year, and they come home to Taipei. So the difference, like you said about Canada, is so important that they're simply who they are, and they don't feel a struggle. But you're right in that identity usually is formed by the other. And that is an important part of the origin of identity. Without a common threat, because we're not communists, because we're not Russian, so we're American. The Cold War mentality of all of those narratives are important for the Taiwanese. But it took the last 30 years for the Taiwanese to come together to say it's not just 本土化. It's creating some kind of civic values that everyone can subscribe to, especially if you think about it. 1 out of 3 babies now in Taiwan are born to mothers who are born not from Taiwan. So 1 out of 3 babies in Taiwan are born to an immigrant mother from Vietnam, from Indonesia. As I said, fertility rate in Taiwan is very low. And all of these, mostly women, they emigrate, they learn Mandarin or Hokkien or Hakka, and they try to live with their in-laws. They try to be part of the community. And so new Taiwanese values really have to incorporate all of those different people and make it stronger. And I heard the same story in Korea, because they have a rising issue with integrating foreign brides as well. These homogeneous societies, which are trying to grow demographically by having more immigrants, are really trying to come to grip with a modern sense of civic identity. And I think you're right in, if you look at Japan, both Japanese identity is both civic and ethnic. It's 2 parts of the same story. But I think for the Taiwanese, they belong to a larger ethnic group. And so they really need to be specific about what makes them a distinct community. Yes?
Let me just add something on David's point about national narrative. That's another aspect of national identity which we'd like to work on. I'm thinking of starting a project on comparative national narratives, hopefully with Shirley's cooperation and support. So when you mention the Canadian national narrative, basically our unity being forged by threat from the United States, my first thought was, are you kidding? That's not part of our national narrative. We never threatened Canada. But then I remembered visiting Halifax, Nova Scotia, and seeing a magnificent 19th century fort, state-of-the-art for its time, and being an American, asked the naive question, who did you build this to? What?
The fort at Louisburg.
Yeah. And I said, who is this supposed to defend Canada against? And the guide said, you. I said,
Burnt down Toronto.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. But you see, that's not part of the American narrative.
Burnt down the White House.
Exactly. Well, I didn't know Canadians did that. I thought the British did that, but you were part of Canada.
We're proud of it.
Okay, you're proud of it. Well, there you go. And this is another part of identity. It goes beyond self-identification. And it's a little bit different from values. It's the national story, and that's something we need to work on too.
Well, just adding quickly to that, because I love the topic, is that the Canadian identity was established in part in the 1770s, 1780s, when all of the people who did not want to be part of the U.S. decided, who were United Empire loyalists, right? That's what we call them. You call them Tories. We call them United Empire loyalists. Moved to Canada, and they increased the Canadian English-speaking population from 1,000 to 40,000. 40,000 people moved in 1770s.
And Boston schools are still closed on the day they all shipped out.
Once again, emigration is not part of the American narrative. Nobody ever wants to leave the United States because we're so wonderful.
Let me. I see a lot of student questions. If I could take all of them.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for coming. I've missed you the last 8 months. You've been giving this presentation in Beijing and Shanghai, most recently at UHK, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to attend, but it's been great. I'm actually ethnically Romanian, born in Romania, raised in the United States and California, so I've seen the battles between the first arriving Taiwanese, then the Chinese, and even among the Taiwanese over identity and how it relates to sports groups. Just really quickly so you understand where I'm coming from. I've been a Korean government scholar. I'm now a Chinese government scholar at Peking University. I'm here on exchange, and last summer I spent in Taiwan doing research and studying Mandarin under the Taiwan-United States Sister Relations Alliance, which is a Taiwanese government scholarship program. So I've been able to experience a lot, and it's been wonderful. Really quickly, I think that your narrative shouldn't start with the 92C, but it should start with the 1986 May 3rd hijacking of China Airlines Flight 334, when Wang Shijie forced the communication to happen and changed the 3 no's to the 3 linkages. That's just one comment. I also think that Taiwan's issue, regardless of what Xi Jinping says, will not be resolved until after the Taiwan experiment ends in 2047. I think China has kind of trapped itself into that straitjacket, and that kind of overarching power dynamic plays into the cross-strait relations. My question is this. Being in Taiwan and having spent a lot of time there, I see that the Taiwanese identity is a very pernicious identity in the sense that it excludes the Waidao. When you go to the Penghus, to Jinmen, to the Maju, to especially Lanyu or even Ludao, not to mention the Xiaoluqiu, excepting Xiaoluqiu, people don't identify with the Taiwanese identity. They say that's the Bundao, we're different people. And I'm really not happy about the exclusionary factor, and as it relates to independence, I'll sum up really quickly, is that people on Taiwan are willing to trade off those islands. They've told me that. I don't know government people, but they're very okay with willing to trade off those islands for Bundao independence, and that's a very scary thing, and I think it's inequitable to the people on those islands, that they won't be included in any new kind of political alliance. So if you could talk about that.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great
He gets the
question.
prize for the most unique question we've heard.
The most unique background. Yes. There was was it there? No. Yes. Go ahead.
Student there.
I think we're out of time.
It's okay. Let me collect the questions. And
So thanks for the talk. I really thought it was a really interesting broad perspective on Taiwan. My question was actually on the assumption of what identity is. And the reason why I bring that up is because I was actually pretty surprised that early in the talk there was a sense that as of 1992, people in Taiwan largely identified as Chinese, and this identity, this identification with being Taiwanese sort of emerged over that time. And I was curious about that because then in one of the subsequent graphs from the NCCU Election Study Center, you see that actually people who identified as Taiwanese or as both Taiwanese and Chinese, that number is actually a lot higher than people who only identified as Chinese. Right, so I just checked the Election Study Center graph. So in their graph, what you see is actually the number of people who identify as Chinese is not that many, even in 1992, right? So as of 1992, the most robust identification was identification as both Taiwanese and as Chinese. And over the years, the people who identify as only Taiwanese has risen, but number 2 is still people who identify as Taiwanese and Chinese. So I think that affects a little bit the assumptions that that this talk has had, and I don't know if Harry and Shirley have looked at this as well, because I don't know that it's that there is a Taiwanese identity that was emerging over time. It's that this Taiwanese identity was always present, right? And that makes sense if you just talk to anybody in Hong Kong, but even in Shanghai, in Beijing, or anybody in a particular town, right? You usually have an identification with your local community as well as a broader community. So it's not, I feel like this talk is built around this assumption that there is this emergence of an identity, but that's not necessarily the case. The other question I had was in comparing Taiwanese identity to a number of other identities, such as America First, as well as the Brexit identity. I mean, in these two cases, right, I think there's actually a very thin line between national identity and racism. And I think that's something that is also worth discussing in the sense that, of course, this identification can be tied to economic policies, etc. But I think it's worth also investigating as to whether any of this is tied to some kind of anxiety that's then driving racist tendencies that have always been present in most cultures, but is now having this venue to come out. It can come out as national identification. We're not racist. We just think Taiwan should come first. We're not racist, but we think Britain or America should come first. And I think that's a part of identification that I think is also important to acknowledge and to not phrase it just as, the young people having this very idealistic vision for Taiwan.
Thank you for your excellent question, two of them. Here.
Thanks. So from an economics perspective, it seems like there's this trade-off between identifying as Taiwan or maybe Hong Kong and the economic prospects, right? If you say, okay, we're going to be more independent from China, our economy could potentially suffer, right? And I'm just wondering if there's some kind of model where people receive some utility for identifying, maybe some emotional utility, but there's also a cost to that, and what models kind of compare those things?
That's a great question. Any more? Well, we got so much to work with here. I want to combine the lady's second question and your question about exclusionary identity. It's a very important part of my work, but it's too much to go into in such a short talk. But the reason Taiwanese identity has come into something what we call emergence of it is, as I said, if you look at the line, the reason I manipulated those lines to show only 2 lines from Zhengzhou University is because to have political spillover, you need the Chinese identities to rise. All right, so most people, and if you look at the identity number, more than half of the people thought they were both Taiwanese and Chinese. It's a very ambiguous identity. And when you say you're both European and Italian, and you say you're only Italian, you cannot be called European, that says totally different things. And I think for the Taiwanese to even say Taiwan first 30 years ago, it was a dirty word, essentially. You couldn't say that. It was totally not allowed, and then it became something you had to say. If you didn't say it, you couldn't start any political campaign. So it was a very extreme sort of change. But I would say that if you look at the identity numbers, what's really important is that majority of people now say they're Taiwanese and only Taiwanese. Why would they want to exclude their Chinese identity? That's a very important part of identity, to express yourself. And I think that the 2 sides of the same coin is what the Romanian student at Beijing University has reminded us of, which is identity building always has an exclusionary element, which is what I talked about. I think the beginning of Taiwanese identity formation, it was very pernicious and polarizing because exclusionary. If you weren't like this, you weren't one of us. And what did that exclude? It excluded so many more groups than just the islanders. Initially, it excluded women. DPP was a very unfriendly party to women. And not only that, it excluded Hakka. The DPP meetings were conducted entirely in Hokkien. I'm both Hakka and Hokkien, so I feel this very much so. The majority, sort of the tyranny of the majority, is an essential part, if you look at Eastern European countries, of the narrative at the beginning stage. And it takes a lot of effort, but I would say that while I'm concerned about your issue and about racism, I think that Taiwan has something going for them that's quite positive. One's identity shouldn't be in conflict with a global identity. But I think the difference is younger people say today, I am a global person, but I'm also Taiwanese. And my Taiwanese identity comes first. And this is, if you look at it, the problem with that is, of course, it's in economic policy terms, it's proposing mercantilism. And you're putting your country's interests before global interests. So should we worry about China's interest first or the world's interest first in climate change? This is a very, very long-standing issue, of course. But there's nothing wrong with coming back to say we should worry about America first or China first or Taiwan first. And this is another issue when you're trying to help people all around the world, but not help people who live in your community. It's going to lead to political consequences. When the poor and the rich live in the same place, like in Hong Kong, like in Taiwan, and they seem to ignore each other. But they're worried about global issues. So I think there's something really positive about recognizing who you are and who your community is, but it should not be racist and it should not be exclusionary. And I think Taiwan is going in a good direction in that if you look at this current president, one of the big issues in becoming elected and what she's doing now is something that even in Korea they haven't embarked on, which is transitional justice. So to look back at different periods of different state violence, whether it's the White Terror or it was under Japanese rule, all of these issues are being put out, and people are confronting their bloody past and the division. And I always start off, and I think the Romanian student talks about the 86 hijacking, which is actually when I start talking about it. But Harry has his own idea, so Harry wants to talk about the 92 consensus. We have a disagreement.
Try to keep the talk shorter rather than longer. So.
Yeah, so we have a disagreement about that. But if you think about the background to all of this, even under the Japanese rule, there was a strong sense of Taiwanese identity, as you said. It's always been. So the reason I came into what I'm doing is because the sense of Taiwanese identity was always there. So it is one school of thought. Many would disagree with me. They would say that identity is created. As David was saying, it was because of Li Tenghui, Chen Shui-bian, education, and those call this identity politics, using identity to manipulate electoral for gains, for politicians. And I think it's really history, sociology, but I think that, Taiwanese also, even now, they're talking about what happened under the Japanese colonization, who are the people who were victimized by it. I think an open debate and discussion about what it means to be Taiwanese can be very positive. It doesn't have to be racist or exclusionary, but it takes time. And if you look at similar places like Korea went through colonization, like Taiwan, but the discussion there is much more difficult to this day. No politicians in Korea can really talk about it very easily and gain and create a consensus on what it means. And until to this day, South Korea hasn't looked at those people who collaborated with the Japanese government. And they're still, people are still talking about it today. And that's why when Trump says Korea was part of China, as he heard from Xi Jinping, it was the only thing anybody wanted to talk about last weekend in Seoul. Only thing. Nobody wanted to talk about anything else but that. So you can see that if you don't have a healthy discussion and confront your past, it could be very dangerous. And I think the Taiwanese are moving in a different direction. Tsai Ing-wen, despite her, I think, failure in proposing economic reforms, has been quite important symbolically because she's a woman. And she's really somebody who didn't speak Hokkien at the beginning when she first came back from LSE. And she's really become a leader in a different way as opposed to the old school, whether it was Li Tenghui or Chen Shui-bian. So anyway, that's one group of questions wanted to address. And I think the issue about sports group is wonderful. We always talk about it. Rivalry has to do, the best example of rivalry is sports. Because sports is you have a rivalry. Harvard only cares about the Yale game. Princeton only cares about the Yale game, and so on and so forth. And I think the rivalry is an important part of who's us and who is them. But when you talk about the Taiwan experience as ending in 2047, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure when the solution will be coming. But I think that my personal goal is I try to do as many talks as possible in universities because I want to meet young people and know what they think. I think 30 years ago, young Koreans and young Chinese and young Taiwanese all thought that 30 years later, and I guess that was me 30 years ago, in 1993, during the Kuang talk, I went to volunteer as an interpreter and translator. During the day, I was working at Goldman Sachs, doing the Singapore Telecom initial public offering. During the night, I went to look around to see if I could do anything to help because so many of the representatives didn't speak English. And nobody would think that in 2017, pretty much the situation remains the same. And whether it's the cross-strait relations tension or North and South Korea. So I think that what is really important is that young people today aspire to contribute to solving the problem. Because in 30 years, we cannot be in the same situation. That would be tragic.
Just make one small point before we conclude. I think it is true that nationalism can be a way of disguising racism. But I think it's also true that oftentimes the kinds of tensions that we're talking about, the establishment, let's call it localist identities, can be put up against the other is of the same race. And that's true in Hong Kong. Yes, we are a multi-ethnic society, but to a very, very small degree. And basically, this is a debate among ethnic Chinese. And it's a debate more about values than it is about race, therefore. The same is true in many countries in Europe. Depends on how you define race, of course. But are Transylvanians and other Romanians of a different race? I don't think so. Depends on how you define it. So we think that, yes, ethnicity in that traditional sense of race, of blood, can be the basic driving force for these tensions and differences and definitions of identity we're talking about, but it need not be. And so sometimes localism is not racist.
Also, racism in the traditional sense has a lot to do with economics. To come back to finally your question about economically, is it beneficial to claim a local identity? Well, you know, traditionally, racism is very interrelated to denying minorities or people who are excluded economic benefits. So in this, you will say, then, what benefit is there to claim to be Taiwanese or to be Hong Konger? Actually, it would tell. This is why the chart is so astounding. There is no benefit, really. If you are a Taishang in China, your taxes are seriously audited the last 2 years. Ever since basically the DPP gained power, China has decided to really clamp down on Taiwanese businesses in China. So it is actually dangerous to claim that you're Taiwanese. And in the fourth quarter last year, group tourism from China to Taiwan dropped up to 40%. So China has decided to penalize the Taiwanese for claiming an identity, for voting for a party that it did not favor. And the Taiwanese suffered, if you will. But fortunately, Taiwan's tourism number was record high last year because the Koreans and the Japanese stepped in. And so 2016, the Taiwanese found out it's actually quite a good thing to diversify your economy because the mainland Chinese business group tourists came to Taiwan. They didn't spend money in mom and pop stores. They were going around in these group tours and, you know, going to designated stores and hotels. And then when they started to get more Korean and Japanese tourists, they were delighted because they were spending money locally and they were higher quality individual tourists, not group tourists. So I think that the prospect for, like you said, Hong Kong or for Taiwan to claim an identity cannot be materially based, and this comes back to your question, which is my whole study, that people are not irrational. They are non-rational. Most of us actually think about what we feel first, and that's what it means, national identity. A lot of it is emotional, and the emotional quantitative gain is immense to belong to a community that you can contribute to, that you can be part of. And I think people are saying today, for example, Brexit is so irrational, so against economic interests of the community. But people knowingly vote for it. Why? And this is the whole question of the Taiwanese identity that I would say my primary reader, those sitting in Beijing, ask themselves, what can we do to make these people change their identity to click, I'm Chinese and I want unification?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very much. I just remind you, tomorrow we have a seminar in the division at noontime looking at the end of the Cultural Revolution. And two of my friends from Italy are going to talk about their perspective as well. So if you something that's of interest to you, please come tomorrow at noon. But again, thank you very, very much for sharing and for stimulating and for being with us today and the last couple of years.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your excellent questions and comments.